Good morning, students. Today we will see with our new chapter or new unit in the Sale of Goods Act, that is transfer of ownership. In the previous chapter, we see previous chapter as well as the previous unit of the Sale of Goods Act, we see what is a sale, what is an agreement to sell, and what are the differences between sale and agreement to sell, as well as what is a caveat emptor and what is the condition, what is a warranty, and how a condition become a warranty. All things are to be there. So all things are to be there. So here, you from the beginning itself, the Sale of Goods Act, there, if a complete sale is to be undertaken when it is there, the ownership is to be passed, isn't it? So at the time of selling, ownership is passed to the buyer. While at the time of an agreement to sell, the ownership is not passing to the buyer, it is still with the seller. So how an ownership is to be passed to the buyer, or what circumstances it is to be passed. This is, we need to take it in or see in this chapter, transfer of ownership. So we will, in detail, we will see what is this. So, transfer of ownership. In the performance of a contract of sale, there may be two distinct stages: transfer of property in the goods and transfer of possession of the goods. So, property is to be transferred as well as possession also to be transferred. So, how a property is to be transferred? Property in goods means ownership in goods. അതായത് സാധനം വാങ്ങുന്നതിനകത്ത് നമുക്ക് ഓണർഷിപ്പ് കിട്ടിയാലേ നമ്മൾ ആ സാധനം ശരിയായ രീതിയിൽ യൂസ് ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റുള്ളൂ. ഇത് സെല്ലറിന്റെ അടുത്ത് ഓണർഷിപ്പും buyer's at the possession we cannot use in the proper way. So that is why property in goods means what? There should be the ownership with the goods, ownership of the goods with the buyer. There are detailed rules relating to the transfer of ownership, and they are discussed in this segment. And there is transfer of possession of goods also. Transfer of possession is different from transfer of ownership. Sometimes the possession may be transferred by the seller to the buyer without transferring the ownership. In a forthcoming segment, the rules relating to the transfer of possession will also be discussed. So, two things are there. One is transfer of property, and another one is transfer of possession. Possession എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ കൈവശാവകാശം, ഓണർഷിപ്പ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ ഉടമസ്ഥാവകാശം. ആ ഉടമസ്ഥാവകാശം ഏതിനകത്താണ്? ട്രാൻസ്ഫർ ഓഫ് പ്രോപ്പർട്ടിയാണ്. ട്രാൻസ്ഫർ ഓഫ് പൊസിഷൻ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ കൈവശം വെക്കുക, പക്ഷെ ഉടമസ്ഥൻ ആരായിരിക്കും? വേറെ ആളായിരിക്കും. അതാണ് രണ്ട് കേസ് സെയിൽ ഓഫ് ഗുഡ്സ് ആക്ടിനകത്ത് കോൺട്രാക്ട് ഓഫ് സെയിലിനകത്ത് ഓർക്കേണ്ടത്. സോ ട്രാൻസ്ഫർ ഓഫ് പ്രോപ്പർട്ടി ഇൻ ദ ഗുഡ്സ് as well as transfer of possession in the goods. Then, what are the significance of the transfer of ownership? The rules relating to the transfer of ownership is important because of the following reasons. Risk prima facie passes with ownership, action against the third party, and insolvency of the seller or the buyer. So, risk prima facie passes with the ownership. What is that? Along with the ownership, the risk also to be passed. Unless otherwise agreed, risk follows the ownership whether delivery has been made or not, and whether the price has been paid or not. Thus, the risk of loss is always on the buyer. However, if the delivery of the goods has been delayed through the fault of either the buyer or the seller, the goods are at the risk of the party at fault. That is called risk prima facie along with the, or passes with the ownership. The risk is to be passed along with the ownership passing. At the time the seller passes the ownership, the risk also to be passed to the buyer. So that is the risk prima facie passes with the ownership. So risk follows the ownership whether the delivery has been made or not, and whether the price has been paid or not. Whatever be the price paid or not, or the item delivered or not, risk is to be passed along with the ownership to the buyer. That is the first case, risk prima facie passes with the ownership. Second is the action against the third party. If the goods are damaged by a third party, only the owner can file a case against it. അത് ഓണർഷിപ്പ് പാസ് ചെയ്താൽ മാത്രമേ അത് പറ്റുള്ളൂ. അപ്പോൾ ഒരു തേർഡ് പാർട്ടി എന്ത് ചെയ്താൽ ഒരു ഫോൾട്ട് ഉണ്ടാക്കുക, ഡിഫോൾട്ട് ആണെങ്കിൽ ഫെയിലിയർ ടു ഡു സോ ഓർ ഡാമേജ് ഉണ്ടാക്കുകയാണെങ്കിൽ the owner can file a case against him and insolvency of the seller or the buyer. Both the cases, insane ആകുക, പാപ്പരാകുക, രണ്ട് കൂട്ടരും, either the buyer or the seller became insolvent, then the question whether the official receiver or the assignee can take over the goods or not depends on whether the property in the goods has been passed from the seller to the buyer. ഓണർഷിപ്പ് പാസ് ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ടോ എന്നാണ് അവിടെ നോക്കുന്നത്. ഏത് കേസിൽ? if the buyer or the seller become insolvent, then in such a case question whether the official receiver or assignee can take over the matter. അവർക്കത് എടുക്കാൻ പറ്റുമോ എന്നുള്ളത്, take over the goods or not depends on whether the property is to be passed from seller to the buyer. Properly passed ആണെന്ന് നോക്കുക. സോ ഈ കേസുകളാണ് ഓർക്കേണ്ടത്. The significance of transfer of ownership, that is risk prima facie passes along with the ownership, and action against the third party in case any damage occurs, then the buyer can or the owner, original owner, can file a case against that, and also the insolvency of the seller or the buyer. That in such a case he can sue against that. Sorry, what is that? Yes, the official assignee or the receiver, that is on behalf of that insolvent person, either the buyer or the seller. Even if the ownership is to be passed properly, then it is okay. Otherwise, problem. Then, suit for price. The seller can sue for the price unless otherwise agreed only if the ownership has transferred to the buyer. Ownership ബയറിനെ ട്രാൻസ്ഫർ ചെയ്താൽ മാത്രമേ സെല്ലർക്ക് പ്രൈസിന്റെ കാര്യത്തിൽ ഓണർക്ക് ബയർക്കെതിരെ എന്തെങ്കിലും കേസിന് പോകാൻ പറ്റുള്ളൂ. അപ്പം one is the risk prima facie passes along with the ownership. Then it is due to the act of the third party. In such a case, he can sue against the third party for the damages occurred. The third case is what? That is the just now we told regarding the insolvency of the buyer or the seller, and also the suit for the price where after passing the ownership to the buyer, then only the seller can sue against anything. Next is rules regarding the transfer of ownership. How the ownership is to be transferred. The goods must be ascertained. Ownership can transfer from the seller to the buyer under a contract of sale only if the subject matter means that the goods are either the specific goods or ascertained goods. Unspecific or unascertained goods cannot be passed the ownership. അതായത് ഇത് ഓണർഷിപ്പ് മാറ്റിയാൽ മാത്രമേ, ഓണർഷിപ്പ് മാറ്റണമെങ്കിൽ എന്താണ്? The goods should be in an ascertained one or a specific goods should be there. In other words, there cannot be a sale proper if the goods are future goods or unascertained goods. അവിടെ ഒരു സെയില് ഇല്ല, കാരണം കാൽക്കുലേഷൻ ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റുകയില്ലാത്ത ഗുഡ്സ് ഉണ്ടെങ്കിൽ there should not be a sale proper occurs. Only an agreement to sell it occurs. So that is the case. Goods must be the ascertained one, calculated one. Second, intention of the parties. Both the parties should intently, means mutually understandable. So subject to above rule, the parties are given the freedom to decide when the ownership should pass from the seller to the buyer. The rule is where there is a contract for the sale of specific or ascertained goods, the property in them passes to the buyer at the time when the parties intend it to pass. The intention of the parties can be ascertained from the terms of the contract, the conduct of the parties, and also the circumstances of the cases may be. So both having what is their intention of the parties to be there, either the buyer or the seller. So intention of the party means what? The parties are given the freedom to decide when the ownership is to be passed from the seller to the buyer. എന്ന് ഉടമസ്ഥാവകാശം കൈമാറ്റം ചെയ്യപ്പെടാം എന്നുള്ള രണ്ട് പാർട്ടീസും തമ്മിൽ there should be some mutual consent should be there. ഒരു സമ്മതം ഉണ്ടായിരിക്കണം. Then the rule is where there is a contract for sale of specific or ascertained goods. അത് ആദ്യം തന്നെ ഓർക്കണം. Only specific goods or ascertained goods, its ownership can be transferred. Unascertained or unspecific goods cannot be transferred. So the rule is where there is a contract for the sale of specific or ascertained goods, the property in them passes to the buyer at the time when the parties intend to it to pass. അവർക്ക് താല്പര്യമുള്ളപ്പോഴാണ് എന്ത് ചെയ്യുന്നത്? It should be passed to the seller, passed from the seller to the buyer. Which one? the ownership. The intention of the parties can be ascertained from the terms of the contract, the conduct of the parties. ഒന്നെങ്കിൽ ആ കോൺട്രാക്റ്റിൽ അത് നോക്കിയാൽ നമുക്ക് മനസ്സിലാകും, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ പാർട്ടീസിന്റെ കണ്ടക്റ്റിൽ നിന്ന് മനസ്സിലാകും. As the circumstances also occurs. സാഹചര്യങ്ങളിൽ നിന്ന് മനസ്സിലാകും. So these are the two cases where the rules regarding the transfer of ownership. First thing is what? The goods must be ascertained one or a specific goods. So specific or ascertained goods ആണെങ്കിൽ മാത്രമേ ownership is to be passed from the seller to the buyer. Then അത് ഒരു സെയിൽ പ്രോപ്പർ ആകണമെങ്കിൽ ഗുഡ്സ് എന്തായിരിക്കണം? ഇറ്റ് ഷുഡ് ബി an ascertained one. ഇപ്പം ഒരു വാഷിംഗ് മെഷീൻ മേടിക്കുക, അതിന്റെ ഓണർഷിപ്പ് ആർക്കാണ്? ബയർക്കാണ്. എപ്പോ? ഫുൾ റെഡി ക്യാഷ് കൊടുത്തു. റെഡി ക്യാഷ് കൊടുത്താൽ agreement is there between both the parties that this thing to be delivered to the house, isn't it? And then the buyer is the usual owner. But that good is a which good? Specific. Specific is what? That particular washing machine, isn't it? Or that is a ascertained valuable goods. Adana, then only the ownership should be passed from seller to the buyer. Second, both the parties must mutually agree with this thing about when the ownership to be passed. ഓണർഷിപ്പ് എപ്പോ പാസ് ചെയ്യണം എന്നുള്ളത് അവർ രണ്ടുപേരും കൂടെ മ്യൂച്വലി എഗ്രിമെന്റ് ഉണ്ടാകും, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ എഗ്രി ചെയ്തിരിക്കും, രണ്ടുപേരും കൂടെ പറഞ്ഞിരിക്കും. ഓക്കെ, അപ്പൊ അതാണ് ഇന്റൻഷൻ ഓഫ് ദി പാർട്ടീസ്. Then next is specific goods or ascertained goods. What is a specific good or ascertained goods? The rules relating to transfer of property in specific goods are as follows. When goods are in a deliverable state, the delivery ചെയ്യാവുന്ന രീതിയിൽ എല്ലാ പാർട്സ് എല്ലാം അയച്ച് പല ഇതായിട്ട് ഇട്ടിരിക്കുകയാണെങ്കിൽ ഡെലിവർ ചെയ്യാൻ മേല. So it should be in a deliverable state. In the sense means what? It should be in a deliverable condition. Where there is an unconditional contract for the sale of specific or ascertained goods in a deliverable state, property in the goods passes from the seller to the buyer as soon as the contract is made. While it is immaterial whether the time of the payment of the price of the delivery of the goods or both is postponed. When the goods are in a deliverable state, it should be in a deliverable condition. That is the first case. Under the specific goods or ascertained goods, the ownership is to be passed. Then when the goods are to be put in a deliverable state, അത് ആ ഒരു കണ്ടീഷനിലാക്കി എടുക്കുക. When there is a contract for the sale of specific goods and the seller is bound to do something for putting the goods in a deliverable state, the property does not pass until such thing is done and the buyer has notice thereof. Buyer need to notice that thing, that it is not in a deliverable condition and they are going to put it in a deliverable state. Then what is there? The ownership is to be passed. So when there is a contract for the sale of specific goods and the seller is bound to do something for putting the goods in a deliverable state, the property does not pass until such thing is done and the buyer has the notice thereof. And third case, when goods have to be weighed, measured, etc. to ascertain the price. Measure ചെയ്യണം, അല്ലെ weigh ചെയ്യണം, അതിന്റെ പ്രൈസ് കണക്കാക്കണമെങ്കിൽ in such a case, what is the standard or what is the condition here? When there is a contract for the sale of a specific goods in a deliverable state, but something has to be done by the seller to ascertain the price, such as weighing, measuring, or testing, then the property in the goods does not pass until such thing is done and the buyer has the notice thereof. അപ്പൊ അത് ഒന്നെങ്കിൽ അത് വേ ചെയ്യണം, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ മെഷർ ചെയ്യണം, അങ്ങനെയൊക്കെയുള്ള കണ്ടീഷൻ വരികയാണ്. ഓക്കെ, അപ്പോ സെല്ലർ ഈസ് നോട്ട് ഇൻ എ പൊസിഷൻ ഓർ നോട്ട് ഇൻ എ the property of the goods still with the seller because it is not in a condition to deliver that thing, isn't it? So in such a case, ownership is not passed and also the property is still with whom? The seller, and the buyer need to get or need to notice that thing. അതാണ് നോക്കേണ്ടത്. When the goods are to be weighed or measured or in a condition in order to ascertain the price or the value of that good. So in such a case, the seller to ascertain the price such as weighing or measuring or testing, etc., the property in the goods cannot pass to the buyer until such things should be done. Such thing in the sense means whether to weigh it or measure it or test it in order to ascertain the value or the price of that product. And then only it should be passed to the buyer. Otherwise, buyer is in notice thereof. Means buyer having critically he need to check these things. So these are the three things with regard to what ascertained goods or specific goods. So one is when the goods are in a deliverable condition or a deliverable state, and another one is what when the goods are to be put in a deliverable condition. Actually, they are not in a deliverable condition, but it should be put in a deliverable condition of state or status, then it is okay. And the third case, when the goods have to be weighed or measured or tested in order to ascertain the price of the product, till that time, the property is vested with the buyer or seller, so that after passing it to the buyer with the ascertaining the price things, after weighing or measuring or testing these things, then only it should be passed to the whom buyer, so that the buyer is in notice thereof. Means buyer need to be take care about these things. All the three cases means goods are to be in a deliverable state, goods are to be put in a deliverable state, and goods are to having weighing or measuring or testing in order to ascertain the price of the product. So this is the ascertained goods or specific goods. So we see ascertained goods or specific goods where the goods are to be in a deliverable status or the goods are to be put in a deliverable status. Means now it is not in a deliverable condition, but the seller needs to put it in a deliverable condition. Then only the buyer will be aware of that thing, and also in such a thing, such things to be done. Then only they can pass the which one the property or the ownership like that. And the third case is what when the goods have to be weighed or measured, that is in order to ascertain the price of the product, then only the property to be passing through to the seller, passing to the buyer from the seller, isn't it? And that also the buyer should take care of that. Then what is an unascertained goods, or what are the conditions with regard to unascertained goods? The following rules applies to the transfer of the property in unascertained goods. The goods must be an ascertained one. When there is a contract for the sale of unascertained goods, no title of the property in the goods is transferred until the goods are ascertained. അപ്പോൾ അതിൽ എന്താ ഉദ്ദേശിക്കുന്നത്? ഗുഡ്സിന് ഒരു വാല്യൂ ഉള്ളതായിരിക്കണം, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഗുഡ്സ് ഷുഡ് ബി എ വെൽത്ത് വൺ. അതായത് ഇറ്റ് ഷുഡ് ഹാവ് നോട്ട് ആൻ അൺഅസർട്ടൈൻഡ് പ്രോപ്പർട്ടി ഓർ അൺഅസർട്ടൈൻഡ് ഐറ്റം ഓർ ഗുഡ്. It should be a ascertained one. Then only what is to be passed, the title of the property to be passed from the seller to the buyer. Unless otherwise it is not taken, no title to be passed. So if the goods are to be an ascertained one, then only the title to be passed. Otherwise, no. That is the first point. Goods must be ascertained one. Second, goods must be in a deliverable state and unconditionally appropriated. So that is where there is a contract for the sale of unascertained goods, the property therein does not pass until the goods are in a deliverable state and are unconditionally appropriated either by the seller with the assent of the buyer or the buyer with the assent of the seller. രണ്ടുപേരും കൂടെ മ്യൂച്വൽ കൺസെന്റ് അവർ രണ്ടുപേരും എന്ത് ചെയ്യുക, എഗ്രി ചെയ്യുക, സോ ദാറ്റ് the goods are in a deliverable state, but it is unconditionally appropriated. Condition is not there, but the goods are in a deliverable state, so that maybe the property will be passed. But the main thing is what? The goods are to be in an ascertained one. Isn't it? So, where there's a contract for the sale of unascertained goods, the property therein does not pass until the goods are in a deliverable state. അത് ഡെലിവർ ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റുന്ന ഒരു രീതിയിലായിരിക്കണം. എന്നാലേ goods are to be in a deliverable state, then only the transfer of the ownership is to be passed from seller to the buyer. And both the parties, the seller and the buyer, must mutually assent with regard to this. That is the case without any condition, that is unconditionally appropriated either by the seller with the assent of the buyer or the buyer with the assent of the seller. So both the parties without any condition they are joined, and also the goods are in a deliverable state, then it should pass. And third case is goods sold on approval or on sale or return basis. So what is that? Sale or return basis. When the goods are delivered to the buyer on approval or on sale or return basis, The property in the goods passes to the buyer when any of the following conditions are satisfied. When the buyer signifies his approval or the acceptance of the goods to the seller. Buyer is signifying his approval. അയാളുടെ സമ്മതം. അയാൾക്ക് സാധനം കിട്ടണം. അതിനു വേണ്ടിയിട്ട് the buyer signifies his approval or acceptance of the goods to the seller, and the buyer does anything adopting the transaction, the examples, the sells or the pledges the goods to a third party, hypothecated or mortgage വെക്കുന്നു ഒരു മൂന്നാമതൊരു കക്ഷിക്ക്. So the buyer does anything adopting these things like sells this to a third party or pledges the goods to a third party like that, and where the buyer does not signify his approval or acceptance but retains the goods without giving a notice of rejection. That is, തിരികെ കൊടുക്കുന്നില്ല എന്നുള്ള ഒരു നോട്ടീസ് കൊടുത്തിരിക്കുന്നു. Thereby he is retaining the property of the goods. So that is the case where the buyer does not signify his approval or the acceptance but retains the goods without giving a notice of rejection, and if a time has been fixed, the time has elapsed. ഒരു സമയം കൊടുത്തു, ഒരു സമയം കൊടുത്തു, ആ സമയം കഴിഞ്ഞു, and if no time is fixed on the expiration of a reasonable time. So സമയം കൊടുത്തിട്ടില്ല എങ്കിൽ ഒരു പർട്ടിക്കുലർ സമയത്തിനുള്ളിൽ നടത്തിയിരിക്കും. So these are the three cases where ascertained goods, unascertained goods, and goods sold on approval or on sale or return basis. So these are the cases with regard to how an ownership is to be passed. So from the first step, we will look into that. That is, what is the transfer of ownership means? There should be a transfer of the property and transfer of the possession of the goods. And how the significance of the transfer of ownership there due to 4 points or 4 points. That is, risk prima facie along with the ownership. That is, risk is to be passed at the time ownership is to be passed. Risk of whether risk means what? Bearing the losses like that. It is with the buyer. When the ownership is passed, it is with the buyer. Then action against a third party. If any third party default or damages any of the property with the buyer, then the buyer can ask for compensation, or he can file or buyer or the owner can file a case against that. Then insolvency of the seller or the buyer. In such a case, both the parties become insolvent. Either the official receiver or the assignee can take over the goods or not, depends on whether the property in the goods have passed from seller to the buyer. So property is to be passed from the seller to the buyer, then only the official receiver or the assignee can take over the goods. അത് പാസ് ചെയ്തതിനു ശേഷമേ പറ്റുള്ളൂ. Then and fourth case is maybe filing a suit against the seller. So what is that? Suit against the buyer by the seller. So that is, the seller can sue for the price unless it is agreed only if the ownership has transferred to the buyer. Then these are the 4 cases. Then we see what are the rules regarding transfer of ownership. There are 2 rules. That is, one thing, the goods must be ascertained. Means specific or ascertained goods is there, then only ownership is to be passed. Second case, both the intention of the parties, mutual consent between the buyer and seller is there, then ownership is automatically transferred from the seller to the buyer. So that is the case. Ownership should pass from the seller to the buyer. The parties are having the freedom to choose that one or to decide that one. That is the intention of the parties. Then another thing with regard to this is specific goods or ascertained goods. What are the rules relating to? One is the goods are in a deliverable status. Another one is the goods are to be put in a deliverable status. And the third case, what is that? So in a deliverable status, or the goods are to be put in a deliverable status, and it should be weighed or measured or tested that the buyer has to be take care of this, and also then only the property or the ownership to be passed from the seller to the buyer. So these are the 3 cases with regard to the ascertained goods or specific goods. What are the rules with regard to unascertained goods for passing the ownership? One thing, the goods should be ascertained. Whatever be the case, the goods should be ascertained. Isn't it? Then second case, it must be deliverable state and unconditionally appropriate. Means what? that the situation or the status with regard to that goods is in a deliverable condition. And also, both the parties, without any condition, mutually agreed upon passing the thing, then it is case of no problem. Unascertained, even though it is an unascertained, it must be an ascertained one, and also it should be in a deliverable status to move. Clear? And third is goods sold on approval or on sale or return basis. ഒന്നെങ്കിൽ വിൽക്കുക എന്നിട്ട് അതിൽ നിന്ന് തിരികെ ഉള്ളത് കൊടുക്കുക അതാണ്. സോ അങ്ങനെയുള്ള കേസിൽ എന്താണ് ഈ കണ്ടീഷൻസ് സാറ്റിസ്ഫൈ ചെയ്യണം. നമ്പർ 1, when the buyer signifies his approval or acceptance. So when the buyer signifies his approval or acceptance of the goods to the seller, that is one case. Agrees to move the goods or ownership is to be transferred. On what basis? Buyer is he signifies his approval or acceptance of the goods to the seller. Then the buyer does anything adopting the transaction or the examples that sells or pledges the thing to the goods to the third party. മൂന്നാമതൊരാളുമായിട്ട് വേണമെങ്കിൽ അത് വിൽക്കുവോ അങ്ങനെയൊക്കെ ഉള്ള ട്രാൻസാക്ഷൻസ് നടക്കുന്നു. പിന്നെ where the buyer does not signify his approval or acceptance. First case എന്തായിരുന്നു? Signifies his approval or acceptance of the goods to the seller. Okay, പറഞ്ഞിട്ട് ഇന്ന ഇതിന് ownership is to be passed. Third case എന്തായിരുന്നു? Where the buyer does not signify his approval or acceptance but retains the goods. It is the possession is with him, who? Buyer, without giving a notice of rejection. തിരികെ കൊടുക്കുന്നില്ല, notice of rejection അത് കൊടുക്കുന്നില്ല. In such a case, ഒരു particular time limit കൊടുത്തിട്ട് ആ time elapsed ആയാൽ can take it. Or സമയം കൊടുത്തിട്ടില്ല എങ്കിൽ on the expiration of a reasonable time period, it should be returned back. So these are the cases with regard to which one? A transfer of ownership. So please have a look at today's classes and please clear your doubts as and when occur through the personal message or calling personally. And please confirm regarding the the videos to be uploaded, and after that confirm it. So I'm going to wind up this session. Thank you.